She really said that? My nephew laughed. Boxed wine would have made more sense. I hadn't even finished placing my 3 bottles on the gift table when Ellen, my own daughter, pointed at them and said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Oh, those, just Dad's cheap shop wine. The real stuff is from Richard's collection." The sommelier froze mid-reach like the bottles had bitten him. Guests chuckled. My ears burned. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her cheap wine had already passed through a charity auction, and tonight they were showcasing it as the rare crown jewel of the event. The crate under velvet? That's mine. So I sat back down, smiled through the sting, and waited. Because when the host lifts that cloth and this room's gonna turn, and my daughters smirk, it won't survive past midnight. My name is Walter Whitaker, and I'm 75 years old. I spend my days among oaken shelves in my modest wine shop, where dust-softened corks whisper stories of patience. My late wife Margaret left me to raise our daughter Ellen alone, teaching me that quiet dignity matters more than applause. These days, Ellen barely visits the shop since marrying Richard Hampton, too caught up in their grand social circle to remember her roots. My hands still tremble when I touch the 3 masterpiece bottles in my cellar, acquired through decades of careful trading, pieces that once passed through an exclusive charity auction. Tonight's party at their estate will test more than wealth. It will measure respect. The familiar scent of aged oak follows me as I carry those precious bottles toward crystal chandeliers. But let me start from the beginning. I arrived at Ellen's estate just as the sun was setting, my weathered hands gripping that simple wooden carrier I've used for special deliveries since the shop opened. You know the type. Sturdy oak with brass corners, nothing fancy but reliable as sunrise. The driveway seemed to stretch for miles, all perfectly trimmed hedges and imported gravel that crunched under my shoes. The foyer hit me like a cathedral, marble everywhere and chandeliers that probably cost more than my shop's annual revenue. Young valets in pressed uniforms darted around, directing guests with practiced efficiency. One of them, couldn't have been more than 20, gave my carrier a dismissive glance. I wanted to tell him about the decades of history cradled in that wood, but some lessons are better learned in silence. Have you ever noticed how wealth changes the very air people breathe? The marble echoed with that particular laugh you only hear at events like these, practiced, performative, like crystal striking crystal. A few faces I recognized from Ellen's wedding turned away as I passed. That's fine. I've spent a lifetime letting my work speak for itself. I made my way to the gift table, where bottles wrapped in designer paper and sporting satin bows preened like peacocks. My 3 bottles, when I set them down, looked almost defiant in their simplicity. Clean labels, perfect corks, stories written in the depth of their color rather than the flash of their packaging. A young woman nearby was already filming arrivals for social media, her phone sweeping past my offerings without a pause. "Daddy!" Ellen's voice cut through the crowd. She air-kissed near my cheeks, careful not to muss her makeup. The scent of her perfume reminded me of the expensive French bottles Margaret used to save up for at Christmas. Have you seen Richard's sponsorship banners? The company's practically fought to be featured tonight. "You look lovely," I said, meaning it. She always did, even as a child covered in grape juice from sampling the new shipments. "The governor might stop by later," she continued, already scanning the room over my shoulder. "Richard's connections are simply incredible these days." I nodded, watching her slip away to greet more influential guests. The gulf between us had grown so wide, I could hardly see the little girl who used to help me polish the shop windows every Sunday morning. Around me, conversations sparkled with brand names and vintage years, but none of the passion that makes wine worth collecting. Let me tell you something about true wine lovers. We're patient people. We understand that some things can't be rushed, not the aging of a fine Bordeaux and not the moment when truth rises to the surface. So I straightened my tie, smoothed down my jacket, and reminded myself of my simple goal for the evening. Preserve dignity, stay gracious, and let the wine speak for itself. The sommelier, a thin man with fashionable glasses, circulated through the crowd like a honeybee, stopping at each cluster of guests to share details about the evening's promised special selections. People followed in his wake, already jockeying for position. I caught fragments of speculation about rare vintages and exclusive estates. I found myself adjusting one of my bottles, turning it just so, making sure the label caught what light it could among its flashier neighbors. The cork had that perfect patina that only decades of proper storage can achieve. You can't fake that kind of age. Believe me, I've seen people try. Just as I was about to check my table assignment for dinner, the sommelier's voice cut across the general murmur, "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin seating, are there any notable selections that should be added to tonight's presentation?" Every head in the room turned toward the gift table. My hands stayed steady, but my heart, that's another story entirely. Note: stopped here as we've covered the arrival, bottle placement, daughter interaction, social dynamics, and sommelier's attention-gathering question, as specified in the prompt. The sommelier drifted toward the gift table, his fingers dancing over labels like he was playing piano. When he reached my carrier, something in his posture changed. Professional interest, maybe. But before he could speak, Ellen's laugh cut through the air like a champagne cork. "Oh, those?" she waved dismissively. "Just Dad's cheap bottles from the shop. Richard's collection has the real wine for tonight. You know that moment when your stomach drops and your skin goes hot all at once? That's what betrayal feels like. I'd felt it once before, the day Margaret's doctor said terminal. But this was my own flesh and blood. The sommelier's hand retreated so fast you'd think the bottles had burned him. Around me, tasteful chuckles rippled through designer dresses and tailored suits. My ears burned, but I kept my spine straight. 40 years behind a counter teaches you how to wear dignity like armor. "Next time, bring boxed wine," my nephew Marcus stage whispered to his wife. "Save Uncle Walt the trouble." More laughter. I added each slight to a mental ledger, the mocked gift, the public belittlement, the way my status seemed to shrink with every passing minute at my own daughter's celebration. Have you ever noticed how shame has a temperature? It runs hot behind your eyes but leaves your fingers ice cold. Like a bad batch of wine stored wrong, all the notes go sour. But you have to maintain your composure. That's what I did. I smiled, thin but present, and took my assigned seat at a side table near the kitchen doors. The servers moved with military precision, pouring selections from Richard's collection. Each bottle they presented came with a story about its label, its brand, its price point. Never its soul. I watched guests raise their glasses in toast after toast, praising logos and vintages they probably couldn't pronounce last year. "Everyone line up for photos," Ellen called out. The crowd shuffled into formation beneath the main chandelier, arranged by what seemed like social credit score. I stayed seated, watching the photographer adjust his lights. No one glanced my way. Sometimes invisibility is a gift. It lets you observe without interference. Across the room, the host, some banking executive whose name I'd already forgotten, huddled with the sommelier near the stage. They kept gesturing toward a velvet-draped crate that hadn't been there during setup. My water glass provided poor company, but at least it gave my hands something to do besides shake. You learn things running a wine shop, like how to count your breaths when a customer questions your expertise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. By the time you reach 6, the urge to react usually passes. I was on my 4th round of counting when the host stepped up to the microphone, tapping it twice for attention. The room hushed. Ellen preened. Richard straightened his Italian tie. The sommelier positioned himself by the veiled crate like a magician's assistant, about to reveal the evening's grand illusion. You want to know the funny thing about standing at the edge of humiliation? Time slows down. I could see every detail. The way the chandelier light caught the host's cufflinks, how Ellen's fingers clutched her glass just a bit too tight, the slight tremor in the sommelier's hands as he gripped the velvet cloth. The microphone let out a soft whine of feedback, and I thought about every bottle I'd ever handled. How some of the finest ones came with the simplest labels. How true quality never needs to shout. The host cleared his throat, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. "Distinguished guests," the host's voice boomed through the speakers. "Tonight's celebration deserves something extraordinary." He paused, playing the room like a conductor. "We're honored to present 3 rare vintages, donated by an anonymous patron whose collection—" He smiled, savoring the moment. "Well, let's just say it would rival any estate in Europe." My hands went cold. Something in his tone, in the way the sommelier gripped that velvet cloth, sent a warning straight to my gut. You know that feeling when your mind pieces together a puzzle a half-second before your heart's ready to accept it? The cloth lifted, crystal caught chandelier light, and 3 familiar bottles stood like soldiers on parade. The air left my lungs in one soft rush. I knew those bottles. Lord, did I know them. The middle one had a tiny nick in its capsule, from the day I'd caught my sleeve reaching for it in the cellar. The corks bore my private stamp, 3 small stars I'd pressed myself. These weren't just similar to my donations from 5 years ago. They were my donations. My mind flashed back to that afternoon, signing the charity paperwork. Margaret had always supported that hospital, even through her final days there. Donating those bottles felt right, a way to honor her memory and help others. I remembered the auction house representative's raised eyebrows when he verified their authenticity. "These are exceptional, Mr. Whitaker." The sommelier was speaking now, rattling off years and regions with the enthusiasm of a true believer. Around me, guests leaned forward, phones raised to capture the moment. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd when he named the vintages. "Impossible," Ellen's voice cut through the murmurs. She was gripping Richard's arm, face flushed. "Dad couldn't afford that. He sells table wine." The words hit like ice water, but I kept my face neutral. 40 years of customer service teaches you how to wear a mask. Still, my pulse ticked up as I watched her gesture dismissively toward my seat. Here was my own daughter, not just mocking me, but erasing any possibility I could have achieved something remarkable. Have you ever held onto a secret that could change everything? It sits in your chest, like a living thing, demanding to be spoken. But timing is everything in wine and in life. The clock above the stage showed 11:15, 45 minutes until the midnight toast. That would be my moment, I decided. Not now, not in reaction to Ellen's spite. But at midnight, when the room was focused and ready, I would stand. One simple sentence would be enough. "I'm glad my donation found such a worthy home." Composure would be my revenge. Dignity, my defense, just as I'd taught Ellen growing up, though she seemed to have forgotten those lessons among the chandeliers and credit cards. The host lifted the first bottle, angling it so the label caught the light. My hands tightened on my chair arms. I knew every curve of that label, every flourish of that font. I'd spent years hunting it down, trading up through smaller acquisitions until I could afford it. The story of its journey to my cellar could fill an evening. Across the room, Thomas, my old friend from the auction house, was frowning thoughtfully at the display. He'd catalogued these bottles himself. I could see recognition dawning in his eyes. Our gazes met briefly, and I gave him the slightest shake of my head. Not yet. The sommelier began explaining the first vintage's history. Every detail he shared was one I knew intimately, though he spoke as if these bottles had materialized from some mysterious European vault. Each time he pointed out a special characteristic, I felt a fresh wave of irony. That enzyme-treated cork. My choice. The slight variation in fill level. I'd monitored it yearly. You want to know what real power feels like? It's sitting quietly while holding the one truth that could flip an entire room on its head. I leaned back in my chair, mind racing faster than my courage could follow. The sommelier was still, singing praise for those bottles. My bottles, while Ellen's words about cheap wine hung in the air like smoke. How do you thread that needle? How do you claim your dignity without letting bitterness poison the room? I'd rehearsed it in my head a dozen times already. I'm glad my donation found such a worthy home. Simple, clean, no accusation, no spite, just truth served neat, letting others draw their own conclusions. The kind of line that would reset respect without burning bridges. But my hands wouldn't stop trembling. The crystal water glass in front of me showed tiny ripples, betraying every micro-movement. Years ago, I could lift a case of wine without a waver. Now I couldn't even keep still enough to maintain my composure. "Did you hear?" A cousin's voice carried from 3 tables over. The anonymous donor must be some European collector. Probably has a castle somewhere. "Makes sense," another replied. "Only old money could afford bottles like that." My wooden carrier sat forgotten on the gift table, looking more humble by the minute. The contrast felt orchestrated now, like some cosmic joke. A few guests glanced between the stage bottles and my contribution, their smirks barely concealed. I pushed my chair back and stood, one hand braced against the table. The stage wasn't far, 15 steps at most. One clear statement could end this farce. My feet even started moving, carrying me forward on autopilot. Then Margaret's face flashed in my mind, clear as yesterday. That last afternoon in the hospital, her hand cool in mine, making me promise, "Don't let Ellen grow up with a bitter father. She'll need your patience more than your pride." I'd kept that promise for 30 years, through teenage tantrums and college rebellions, through her marriage to Richard and the gradual drift toward his world of brand names and social climbing. I'd smiled at slights, accepted exclusions, chosen peace over confrontation. The memory hit me like a physical wave. My knees actually buckled, forcing me to grab a nearby chair. What was I doing? Was I really about to turn her celebration into a stage for my wounded ego? The chandelier light fractured across 100 wine glasses, each crystal prism throwing rainbows that suddenly seemed to mock my presumption. Maybe Ellen was right. Maybe I was just a small-time shopkeeper who'd lucked into a few good bottles and couldn't accept his proper place anymore. I lowered myself back into my seat, feeling every one of my 75 years. The room's chatter continued around me, but I kept my eyes down, studying the tablecloth's weave. Fine linen, probably imported. Another reminder of how far this world was from my modest shop. Sometimes, I thought, respect isn't something you can reclaim. Sometimes you just have to. A throat cleared behind me, cutting through my surrender like a knife through silk. A familiar baritone voice, one I hadn't heard in years but knew instantly. "Excuse me, host," Thomas called out, his auction house authority still commanding attention after retirement. "I might help with provenance." My head snapped up. Thomas stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair catching the light. I hadn't even known he was invited, but there he was, like some guardian angel of vindication, ready to speak truth into a room full of assumptions. For a moment, our eyes met. He gave me the smallest of nods, and I saw in his face the same thing I'd seen decades ago when he first evaluated my cellar: absolute respect for the craft, regardless of the craftsman's social standing. Thomas's voice carried that same quiet authority I remembered from auction days, the kind that made millionaires lean forward in their chairs. You know the type, more commanding in a whisper than most men manage with a shout. "I believe I can shed some light on these particular bottles," he said, adjusting his cuffs as he approached the stage. Even after retirement, he moved with that deliberate grace that came from handling fortunes in fragile glass. "I catalogued them myself. Oh, must be 7 or 8 years ago now." The host blinked, clearly thrown off script. "You're certain? May I?" Thomas gestured to the first bottle, and when the host nodded, he lifted it with practiced care. His fingers traced the label's edge, finding that slight ripple in the paper that had always bothered me. "Yes, here we are. Lot 127 from the spring charity auction." The identifying marks are quite distinctive. My chest tightened as I watched him work. Every movement was measured, every observation precise. This wasn't revenge or drama, just pure professional documentation, and that made it all the more powerful. Notice the cork stamp. Thomas held the bottle at an angle, letting chandelier light catch the wax seal. Classic housemark, but with that small production variation in the left corner. Only appeared in their 82 bottling. Phones appeared everywhere, recording his inspection. The sommelier practically bounced on his toes, like a student watching a masterclass. I caught fragments of whispers, former Sotheby's, and handled the Getty collection. Ellen's knuckles had gone white around her champagne flute. I could see bubbles racing up the glass in jagged streams, matching her rigid posture. She whispered something to Richard, who kept shaking his head. Their perfect evening was shifting beneath them, and neither knew quite how to steady it. I pushed back my chair and stood, smooth and unhurried. Part of me wanted to walk right up there, to stand beside Thomas and claim my place. But that wasn't the play anymore. Sometimes the strongest move is staying still, letting truth find its own path to light. The second bottle, if I may. Thomas set down the first with silk-soft precision. "Ah, yes, there's that distinctive nick on the capsule. I remember noting it specifically in the condition report. My mind flashed to the day I'd made that nick, my hand slipping while cleaning decades of cellar dust. I'd cursed myself then, thinking I'd damaged something precious. Now it was becoming the perfect fingerprint, proof of provenance that no one could deny. Ellen's eyes darted around the room, probably counting how many guests were filming. Her social media narrative was unraveling in real time. You'd think that might bring me satisfaction, watching her carefully curated image crack. Instead, I felt an old familiar ache, the same one I'd felt when she fell off her bike at 7 and refused to let me help her up. Thomas caught my eye across the room, one professional to another, one man who'd spent his life learning the quiet language of wine to another. I gave him the smallest nod. "Go ahead, old friend, let the truth speak for itself." He turned back to the host, who seemed to be processing the shift in his evening's carefully planned flow. "Would you mind if I used the microphone? There are some fascinating details about these bottles' journey that your guests might appreciate." The sommelier was already reaching for the mic, eager as a child at Christmas. Thomas took it with a small bow of thanks, then cleared his throat. The room leaned in, sensing a moment of revelation. Even the servers stopped circulating, trays balanced carefully as they turned to listen. Just like that, my midnight deadline felt less urgent. Sometimes dignity doesn't need a grand gesture. Sometimes it just needs a steady hand to point out what was there all along. Thomas squared his shoulders and addressed the room with the same precise tone he'd used to present. Multi-million-dollar lots. These bottles were catalogued as Lot 127 in the spring charity auction, donated by Walter Whitaker. I have the receipt number right here. He pulled out his phone, tapping quickly. AC2847B. I remember because Walter insisted on keeping everything properly documented. You could have heard a cork drop in that ballroom. I felt the collective intake of breath, like the whole crowd had been dunked in ice water. Phones lowered slowly as people processed what they'd heard. "No way," someone whispered from the back. Then again louder, "No way." I watched the change ripple through the room. My cousin Margaret's face went from that knowing smirk to something close to horror. Uncle James actually took his glasses off and wiped them, as if clear lenses might show him a different truth. Even Aunt Patricia, who'd been so quick with that boxed wine comment earlier, now couldn't seem to look in my direction. Ellen's smile was a brittle thing, stretched too thin across her face. She leaned close to Richard, whispering urgently. He didn't even turn to her, just kept stabbing at his phone like it might offer some escape route from this moment. The blue light made his face look sickly. The sommelier caught my eye and gave me a small, formal bow. I could read the professional respect there, the acknowledgement of a fellow craftsman. It reminded me of long-ago afternoons in my shop, teaching young enthusiasts about bottle aging and cellar conditions. Amazing how validation can come full circle. "Mr. Whitaker," the host called out, "would you join us on stage? I believe some recognition is in order." I stayed in my seat, keeping my hands flat on the tablecloth to steady them. "Thank you, but not just yet," my voice carried clearly in the hushed room. Let Thomas finish his explanation." The truth was, I wanted to give Ellen room to breathe, to find her way back from this corner she'd painted herself into. "Remember when you were small, sweetheart? How I'd always wait while you figured out your own mistakes. Some lessons have to come from inside." A young server approached my table, moving with careful grace through the tension. She set down a fresh crystal glass, the kind reserved for the special vintages. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I saw something like approval there before she glided away. I lifted the glass halfway, a quiet salute to Thomas's continuing commentary about providence and storage conditions. The crystal caught the chandelier light, throwing little rainbows across my tablecloth. Just then a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Hold on." It was one of Ellen's society friends, her tone sharp with disbelief. "Are you saying she actually thought her father brought cheap bottles to her own party?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. I kept my glass steady, though my hand wanted to shake. Not from anger anymore, but from that old deep sadness that comes with watching your child corner themselves. Ellen's perfect smile finally cracked. She reached for Richard again, but he was still lost in his phone, his fingers moving faster now. The whispers started growing louder, and I could see her realizing how quickly social currency could evaporate. "Come on, sweetheart," I thought. "You know the way home from here. It's the same path we walked when you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with your ball, when you blamed Tommy next door. Remember how much better you felt after telling the truth?" But Ellen just stood there, frozen between her crumbling facade and whatever truth she wasn't ready to face. The crystal in my hand caught another splash of light, and I remembered how she used to love making prisms dance on the shop walls when she was little. The room waited, all those eyes moving between Ellen and me, wondering how this scene would play out. I kept my seat, kept my glass at that patient half-raise. Sometimes the hardest part of being a father is knowing when to stay silent, when to let your child find their own way back to solid ground. The room's energy shifted like wine changing in a glass. You could almost see the social current flowing away from Richard's branded display toward that authenticated crate on stage. Funny how quick people are to follow the scent of authenticity once they catch it. I kept my seat, maintaining that same quiet posture I'd learned from decades behind the shop counter. Sometimes the best way to handle a delicate vintage is to let it breathe undisturbed. The silence felt thick enough to slice. Margaret, my dear cousin, who'd been so quick with her snide comments earlier, suddenly found her water glass fascinating. She traced its rim with one manicured finger, studiously avoiding any eye contact with our end of the room. Amazing how interesting tableware becomes when you're trying to disappear. You know, it reminded me of those endless Sunday dinners after Sarah passed when Ellen was 12. She'd sit just like that, shoulders hitched up around her ears, chin pulled tight, her tell when she was about to dig her heels in against an uncomfortable truth. Some things never change, I suppose. The whispers were getting louder now, little eddies of conversation spinning through the crowd. I caught fragments. Can't believe she'd say that about her own father. And those bottles must be worth... Ellen stood up straighter, those shoulders climbing even higher. I recognized that stance, and she was gathering herself for something. Here it comes, I thought, the denial that follows the tell, right on schedule. "Oh, everyone's being so dramatic," she announced, forcing a laugh that landed flat in the quiet room. "It was just a joke. Daddy knows I was kidding." She tried to catch my eye, but I kept my gaze steady on my water glass. Some jokes cut too deep to patch with a casual brush-off. The hall stayed quiet. You could hear ice settling in glasses, the soft brush of expensive fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ellen's words hung in the air, finding no friendly ears to nest in. Even her usual society allies seemed suddenly absorbed in their phones or the pattern of the carpet. I could have stood up then, could have let loose with every hurt and disappointment. God knows there was enough fuel there, but confrontation would only cement her pride in place. I'd learned that lesson the hard way through her teenage years. Better to let the moment ripen naturally, wait for that midnight toast when truth could speak for itself. The old grandfather clock by the terrace caught my eye. 11:43. Its brass pendulum swung with that same steady rhythm I remembered from my own father's shop. Marking time until everything changes. 17 minutes. Just 17 minutes to hold this course. I sipped my water slowly, running through the single sentence I'd prepared. No accusations, no bitterness, just a clear statement of provenance that would let the room draw its own conclusions. The crystal felt cool against my lips, grounding me in the present moment. The host was moving now, conferring quickly with staff members who nodded and peeled off toward the kitchen. He raised his hand, trying to settle the murmuring hall back to order. But before he could speak, Richard stepped forward. Something was off in his usual smooth manner. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the microphone, and I noticed a sheen of sweat at his temples, despite the room's perfect climate control. That tremor caught my attention. I'd seen it before in customers facing unexpected bills for precious vintages. It was the shake of someone watching numbers that wouldn't add up. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward my son-in-law as he gripped the microphone stand. Ellen reached for his arm, but he shrugged her off, keeping his gaze fixed straight ahead. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background, counting down to whatever truth was about to spill. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie like it was suddenly too tight. "I want to address these speculations," he said, aiming for his usual boardroom confidence but landing somewhere shakier. "Our cellar rivals any collection in the state. We've invested considerably in... Do you have the provenance logs?" A silver-haired guest in the front row looked like one of those retired wine critics Ellen was always trying to impress, cut in with the kind of precise question that makes salesmen sweat. I'd seen that exact flinch behind my counter countless times when customers tried to bluff their way through wine knowledge. Richard's polished veneer cracked just a hair wider. "Well, naturally, we maintain extensive documentation of our..." He trailed off, tugging at that tie again. "The important thing is maintaining standards appropriate to our position. Our guests expect—" "But the authentication papers?" Another voice chimed in. 4 bottles of that caliber. You could almost see Richard's mental ledger sheets shuffling as he tried to find stable ground. The room had gone from whispers to the kind of silence that makes every word echo. "Look," he said, a fresh shine of sweat catching the chandelier light. "We're highly invested in presenting the proper image. Our social obligations require certain ongoing premium acquisitions to maintain the standard expected of—" The word slipped out so naturally he probably didn't even notice. "We've leveraged considerable resources to ensure our collection reflects our status." Leveraged. In my 40 years of business, I'd watched that word sink more than a few ambitious ventures. It's amazing how much debt can hide behind 7 letters. A low murmur rippled through the hall. The sommelier, who'd been so eager to dismiss my bottles earlier, suddenly found the floor fascinating. Even the servers paused their circuits, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. I stayed quiet, hands folded in my lap. No need to twist the knife when reality was doing the job just fine. Remember what I said about letting wine breathe? Same principle applies to truth sometimes. The grandfather clock caught my eye again, 11:56 now. Those steady ticks carrying us all toward midnight, toward the moment when a simple, honest statement could reset the entire evening's balance. The host must have felt it too, the need to redirect this train before it jumped the tracks entirely. He moved toward Richard, hand extended for the microphone, probably hoping to steer us back to safer territory with the official toast. I started to rise, my single prepared line ready on my tongue. Just a calm statement of fact. I certified those bottles' provenance myself before, donating them to charity. No accusation needed, just quiet truth. But then Ellen's laugh cut through the hall, that brittle, too bright sound I remembered from every childhood moment when she felt cornered. "Oh, this is ridiculous," she announced, her voice skating on the edge of control. "Everyone knows Dad could never keep bottles like these. He runs a little shop in a strip mall, for heaven's sake." The room swung toward me like a compass, finding north. Even the servers stopped pretending to be invisible. The grandfather clock's massive minute hand clicked into place, marking midnight with the same quiet certainty I'd built my life around. In that suspended moment, I felt every eye in the room waiting for my response. The weight of decades, of quiet work, of careful choices, of letting quality speak for itself, settled on my shoulders like a familiar coat. The time had come to speak my piece. The final chime echoed through the hall as the host extended the microphone toward me. Funny how a moment you've been waiting for can still catch you off guard when it arrives. I straightened my tie, an old habit from decades of meeting customers, and made my way to the front. The chandeliers cast pools of light that reminded me of sunny afternoons in my shop, when dust motes would dance above the shelves and make even modest bottles gleam like treasures. I'd taught Ellen to read labels in that light, back when she still believed her dad knew something worth learning. "Thank you all for your kindness this evening," I said, keeping my voice steady. The microphone picked up every word with perfect clarity. No hiding now, even if I'd wanted to. But I didn't want to hide. Not anymore. "If you'll permit me, I'd like my old friend Thomas to complete the record of these bottles' journey." Thomas stepped forward with the same careful precision he'd used when handling auction lots. "Of course, Walter." He adjusted his glasses and drew a small notebook from his jacket. Even retired, he kept meticulous notes. "I personally catalogued these 3 bottles 7 years ago when they were donated to the Children's Hospital Foundation auction. The lot number was 247B, and I can confirm they originated from Walter Whitaker's private cellar." He detailed the precise characteristics, the cork stamps, the capsule markings, even that small nick I'd remembered. Each fact landed like a quiet hammer, building an unshakable foundation of truth. "The winning bid set a regional record for that year's auction," Thomas added. "Every penny went to the pediatric ward." I nodded, turning to address the room directly. "I'd like to thank the original bidders, whoever they may be, for maintaining these bottles so beautifully. And especially the Children's Hospital Foundation. They do remarkable work." A few heads nodded. Someone near the back dabbed at their eyes. I could have stopped there. Let the facts speak for themselves. But Ellen was still my daughter, still that little girl who used to sit on my counter and help me chalk prices on the display boards. I turned to face her. Grace travels farther than laughter, I said softly, offering the words like an open hand. The hall went so quiet you could hear ice shifting in water glasses. Ellen stared at me, lips parted but no sound coming out. For just a second, I caught a glimpse of uncertainty in her eyes, that flicker of a child realizing she might have misjudged something important. But then she turned to Richard, her expression hardening into something more familiar. "Darling, perhaps you should—" Richard tried to summon up another smile, the kind that probably worked wonders in board meetings. But here, under these lights and these truths, it crumbled before it could fully form. He tugged at his collar again instead. The sommelier cleared his throat. "With your permission," he said, gesturing toward the first bottle, "I believe we should honor these vintages with a proper ceremonial pour, just an ounce each to appreciate their journey." He'd barely finished speaking when a sharp voice cut through from the second row. "Speaking of journeys," said a silver-haired man I recognized from financial coverage in the papers. "Richard, how are those debt covenants looking? Do they still allow for luxury acquisitions like these?" Richard's face went from flushed to pale so fast it was almost impressive. The word leveraged seemed to hang in the air between us all, gaining weight with each passing second. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind flashed back to every cautious decision I'd made running my shop. Slow growth, careful inventory, no debt beyond what I could cover in a bad month. Simple rules that had kept me steady through 4 decades of economic ups and downs. The host stepped forward, probably hoping to redirect the conversation, but the damage was done. You could feel the room's attention shifting from the bottle's past to the estate's financial present. Richard forced a chuckle that sounded like ice cracking. "Oh, you know how these paper games work, Martin. It's all about strategic positioning." "Strategic positioning doesn't override covenant restrictions," Martin interrupted, his financial expertise showing in every crisp syllable. "When estates leverage themselves for appearances, the reputational risk becomes—" He paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Well, let's say substantial. You know that moment when a room shifts, when the polite veneer starts to crack and something harder shows through. I felt it happening, like watching wine slowly stain a white tablecloth. No stopping it once it starts." The host, Charles Preston, I remembered now, stepped forward with the careful manner of someone who's just realized his own reputation might be at stake. "Richard, perhaps we should address these concerns directly, for the sake of transparency." Richard's hand went to his collar again. The silk tie that probably cost more than a month's income from my shop suddenly seemed to be strangling him. "We've made some aggressive moves in the market, leverage positions that reflected our confidence in future growth." He was using the language of boardrooms, but even guests who'd never balanced a business checkbook could smell the desperation now. Martin wasn't finished. "And these premium acquisitions you've been showcasing?" Martin gestured toward the branded display. "Are they all what they claim to be?" The silence that followed lasted 2 heartbeats too long. Richard's shoulders slumped just enough to tell the truth before he spoke it. "We worked with suppliers who helped us maintain a certain image. Some bottles might not be exactly what their labels suggest." The whispers started at the back of the room and rippled forward like wind through wheat. I saw 3 people in sponsorship badges lean together, their expressions dark as corked wine. But I kept my face neutral, my hands relaxed at my sides. I'd spent 40 years learning that real quality never needs to shout. I caught the sommelier's eye and gave him a small nod. He understood immediately, moving to the crate with the sort of grace that comes from genuine respect for the craft. "If I may," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "these authenticated vintages deserve our attention." He lifted the first bottle with practiced care. "The ceremonial pour, as tradition demands." Ellen's voice hit my ear like a cracked note. "None of this matters," she hissed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Not if the room believes us. It's all about perception." I could hear the panic climbing in her throat, transforming into the sharp edge of anger. The same tone she'd used to dismiss my cheap bottles earlier. But now it sounded hollow, like knocking on an empty cask. I chose silence. Some lessons teach themselves better without commentary. The sommelier held the first glass up to the chandelier light. "Notice the depth of color," he said. "The way it catches the light tells us about its journey. And the nose." He paused, inhaling, First, we detect dried violets, then perhaps a hint of... A discreet cough interrupted him. One of the sponsors, a silver-haired woman in a tailored suit, had approached Charles. Their conversation was quiet, but in the newly hushed room fragments carried. Need to reassess our involvement. Matter of institutional reputation. After tonight's revelations, Charles's face tightened. He'd built this evening around showcasing the estate's prestige. Now he was watching it unravel like a poorly woven cloth. The sommelier continued his tasting notes, professional to his core, but the room's attention had split, half following his expertise, half watching the sponsor slip away from Charles with a polite but final nod. Through it all, I stood still. Not because I needed to see Ellen's carefully constructed world crack, but because sometimes dignity is just about standing quietly while truth does its work. Charles looked like a man who'd just watched his retirement portfolio vanish. His complexion had gone from rosy host to church paper pale in the space of 10 minutes. But I'll give him credit. He knew how to navigate a crisis with grace. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, straightening his jacket, "we thank our generous sponsors for their continued..." He faltered for just a heartbeat. "Their valued support of tonight's celebration. As we draw our evening to a close..." I raised my hand slightly, the way I used to when asking permission to speak at Merchant Guild meetings. "Charles, might I have 30 seconds?" Ever the professional, he managed a genuine-looking smile. "Of course, Walter. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Whitaker." The microphone felt lighter than I expected. Funny how small things strike you in big moments. Remember those oak shelves I mentioned? The ones in my shop that held more stories than bottles? I thought of them now, how they never needed fancy lighting or gilded signs to do their job. "Thank you all," I began, keeping my voice level. "You know, in my business, the finest craftsmanship often arrives without fanfare. No spotlights, no brass bands. Just quiet excellence waiting to be discovered." I gestured toward Thomas, who stood near the sommelier. "We're fortunate to have guardians of truth in our field. Thomas, whose memory and integrity serve us all. Our sommelier, whose expertise honors the craft. And yes, the charity auction house that preserved these bottles' story when I donated them years ago." The room had gone pin-drop quiet. You could almost hear the dust settling on crystal. I turned toward Ellen, my daughter, the little girl who used to help me polish glasses on Sunday mornings, who knew every shelf in the shop by heart before she could read. Standing there in her designer dress, she looked both powerful and fragile, like a champagne tower. Impressive, but one wrong move from collapse. "Sometimes," I said, choosing each word carefully, "we forget that family roots run deeper than any foundation. Pride can blind us, make us mistake flash for substance." I paused, giving her space to hear the olive branch in my words. "A simple acknowledgement of truth does more for lasting bonds than any grand gesture." She shifted her weight, eyes darting between the authenticated crate and the sea of watching faces. I recognized her expression, the same one she wore at 12 when caught in a fib about homework. The truth hovering right there, waiting for courage to speak it. I felt the old urge to lecture, to lay out every lesson learned over decades of patient work. The father in me wanted to explain how respect grows like good wine, slowly, carefully, honestly. Instead, I just rested my hand on the crate's wooden edge. Sometimes the quietest gestures speak loudest. "Look at the glass itself," I said, stepping back so the bottles commanded center stage. "Notice how it doesn't compete with the light. It simply reveals what's true." Ellen drew in a sharp breath. For a moment, just a flicker, I saw her shoulders soften, her lips parted as if the apology might finally break free. The room seemed to lean forward, ready to witness Grace trump pride. But then she swallowed hard, and I watched the walls go back up behind her eyes. Charles caught my meaning perfectly. He signaled to the lighting booth, and the house lights dimmed until only a single beam remained, painting those 3 bottles in pristine clarity. They stood like silent witnesses, their labels catching the light just so, telling their own story without a single word needed from me. Standing there in that single beam of light, I felt the weight of decades lift from my shoulders. You ever notice how truth, once it's finally out, has a way of settling things all on its own? What we've witnessed tonight, I said, keeping my voice gentle, carries 2 simple lessons. First, about respect. I gestured to the scattered whispers and shifting stances around the room. See how naturally people align with truth once it's clear. No force needed, just patience. Thomas nodded from his spot near the crate, and I caught a few guests discreetly stepping away from the branded display wall where my daughter and son-in-law's premium collection stood exposed. And second, I continued, about substance versus show. I didn't need to point out how James, my son-in-law, had gone, ashen after admitting their leveraged status. The finance-minded guest was already conferring with other sponsors, their expressions grave as actuaries at tax time. But I hadn't come for revenge. God knows running a wine shop teaches you that the finest vintages need careful handling. "Robert," I called to the sommelier, "would you honor us by presenting bottle 1? He stepped forward with professional grace, cradling that dusty legend like a newborn. The light caught its shoulders just right, reminded me of winter afternoons in my cellar when sun would slip through the high window and paint my bottles in gold. "Note the clarity," Robert said, lifting the bottle. "The depth of color through the shoulder, textbook signs of proper aging." Around the room, phones disappeared into pockets. Sponsors drifted toward the exit, leaving my daughter's carefully arranged display abandoned. One by one, guests turned their attention from flash to substance, just as they did in my shop when I'd guide them past fancy labels to honest craftsmanship. "Thomas," I said, "would you join me? I believe you've earned a share of this moment." The retired auctioneer stepped up, his expert's eye already reading the story in that glass. Robert poured with precision, just an ounce each, enough for ceremony. The aroma rose like a memory. Cedar, dark, plum, patience distilled into liquid poetry. I turned slightly, letting the spotlight catch the bottle's profile. Funny how something so simple could say so much. No gold foil needed, no trumpet fanfare. Just clean glass, clear providence, and 50 years of careful stewardship. "Look closely," I said, though I barely needed to. Every eye was fixed on that quiet masterpiece. See how it doesn't demand attention, doesn't need to shout its worth. The light played across the bottle's shoulders like old friends sharing a secret. In that beam you could read the whole story. Decades of careful selection, climate-controlled storage, and most importantly, the honest work that made such care possible. I lifted my glass, but not in triumph. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something my wife used to say when teaching Ellen to sort inventory. True worth never wears a price tag. The vintage bottles stood in their spotlight, testament not to wealth but to integrity. They'd started in my modest cellar, passed through charity to grander halls, and now stood here, unchanged by all that travel. Their worth, like truth itself, needed no decoration. I let the silence hold, knowing some lessons are best learned in quiet. The light painted those 3 bottles in crystal clarity, and in their stillness lay all the vindication I'd ever need.